Hoodoo plant mamas, get your soul fed and your spirit read.
This here ain't no trend. I possess the power from way back when. Back when folk were stripped from all of their kin, so they had to find the magic within. So I call on my ancestors and gather my herbs. I conjure at my altar. Voodoo plant mama. I manifest growth and I release trauma.
Child, we just out here trying to water our plants and mind our business, you know? Everybody ain't from the deep south, man. Everybody can't have culture like us.
Hey y'all, we have made it to the end of this season. Welcome to the season finale of Hoodoo Plant Mamas. I am one of your co-hosts, Leah Nicole.
And I'm Danny B.
And today we have the pleasure of talking with Junauda Petrus, who wrote The Stars and the Blackness Between Them. But before we get into that interview, Danny B, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay. It's going into the holiday break and everything. Yeah, I'm doing good, and I'm excited to share this this season finale because it was such a fun episode. It was such a we went down a rabbit hole, but I loved it because it was just so organic. So yeah, how are you?
Like you, I'm pretty excited about December. I'm excited about the end of the year. I'm excited about wrapping up this podcast, wrapping up the revision on my book, and just kind of enjoying December, cleaning up my house, decluttering. That's what I'm looking forward to most.
Love to see it. What are you thankful for this week?
I think this week, well, since this is the end, I do want to say that I'm grateful to everyone that we've spoken to this season. I'm grateful that they took the time out to speak to us and to share their wisdom, share their work. So, yeah. What are you grateful for?
Same. I am thankful for all the wonderful people we got to spend time with in some capacity for the podcast. It was such rich conversations. And yeah, and I'm thankful that we made it through our third season, which is so
Yes.
wild to me, and our first anniversary. Like we
Yes.
officially have a 3-season podcast. So
Yeah. And we have like 16,000 downloads.
wow, love to see
Yeah.
it.
So, shout out to our listeners.
Yes, thank y'all for supporting. I'm proud of us. Like, I'm grateful for the work that we did because we started this in the middle of a pandemic. The
Yes.
pandemic was not over the
It still
October
ain't.
in 2020. Like, yes, we started this while we were both going through our own individual struggles with a plethora of things and new beginnings. You had just new beginning of like you quit that job that you hated,
Yeah.
and I got back into a graduate program, which is a whole nother thing. But I, you know, I'm just thankful that we had this. This is something we created and made really beautiful, and so far it has been a success.
Yes, it has.
So let's get into some ways to support the Hoodoo Plant Mamas podcast. You can follow us on social media. We're on Twitter at Hoodoo Plants and Instagram at Hoodoo Plant Mamas. You can also rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. To monetarily support our podcast, you can join our Patreon. We have a $2 tier for those who want to give every month to show their support. Our $5 all access tier includes monthly minisodes, a newsletter, and plant content. For our December minisode, we're going to be recapping the season. So if you're interested in hearing about our favorite moments and ideas that we're still wrestling with, make sure to join our Patreon. Also, we have 12 minisodes that are exclusive to our Patreon if you miss us while we're on hiatus.
If you prefer a one-time donation, you can give any amount you want on Cash App, hashtag Hoodoo Plant Mamas, or PayPal, hoodooplantmamas@gmail.com. Thank you, Rashonda, for your donation. Rashonda wrote to us saying, "Thank you for the work that you're doing and the knowledge that you all are sharing." Thank you, Rashonda. If you're interested in sponsoring an episode, email us at hoodooplantmamas@gmail.com. We especially want to work with Black, Indigenous, POC-owned, and queer-owned businesses. Let's get into this interview. Hey y'all, so today we are joined by Junauda. Junauda, would you like to introduce yourself and your work?
Yeah. I am a writer, runaway witch, cosmic bag lady, soul sweetener. Yeah, and grateful to be alive and grateful to heal and priestess in any way the universe inspires me to. So, yeah, and I'm of Caribbean descent and Black African descent, and I consider myself also an African American, born and raised in Dakota land, sacred Dakota land in Minneapolis, aka Minneapolis. And yeah, and I also have written a young adult book called The Stars and the Blackness Between Them.
Yes, and today we wanted to talk about that book. So I came to The Stars and the Blackness Between Them knowing it was a Black queer teen romance. And that's how it was promoted. But I feel like it's an undersell because there's so much in the book. There, you covered spirit, you covered dreams, astrology, herbal medicine. So my question is, why did you choose young adult as a vessel for all of this knowledge?
Oh my gosh, it's fun because I think young adult chose me in a lot of magical ways. Because initially, this was just a sentence, an idea. It was just, okay, there's somebody who's has like a sentence of a death sentence in incarceration, and then a kid who has a sort of existential possibility towards death. Like that was the idea. The story wasn't even a queer initially when I, came up with the idea. But it just was sparked in me. And it was around the time that I was, very much ensconced and continue to be ensconced in local resistance against the police state and abolition towards the prison industrial complex. So I think for me, the experience of being in this realm while also having had a ton of experience working with young people and just like loving writing, I think all of these things sort of guided me towards, this book being a young adult book. And the characters were also, younger characters. And I think um, it's interesting because I think in so many ways since I've been writing, and I think writing has always been therapeutic to me. And I think in a lot of ways, this book was me writing spaces that my young queer self needed. So I think the book, everything was just so organic about it. Like, even when I wrote it, I wasn't thinking, like, I'm writing a book that I'm going to get published. I just was writing a story that wouldn't leave me alone. And then things started to happen. I shared it with my mentor, who Alexis Duveau, another tremendous queer Black writer of Caribbean descent, really was one like, baby, you want to write you a queer book. Write you a queer book. And I was like, you're right. You're very right. I think that is a thing that the book certainly is a young adult book, but there was just so much that was like coming through me when I started writing it. Like I would ask my editor, I'd be like, what do you think about this thing? Do you think this can fit? And he was like, just write whatever comes to you, just write. Like he just was very much just write. So I think a lot of the way that the story just showed up and blossomed in me, like identified itself to me. And I'm glad that it's a young adult book because young people read it. And I think it's a thing that once it became a young adult book, I very much wanted it to give young people all of the science and the knowledge and ideas that I had to wait to get really grown to have access to. Um, so yeah, I think that I'm glad it's in the young adult space because also people our age group and younger, their 20s and older read my book. So a lot of people read young adult because we're all kind of a kid and young and processing things from our youth. So yeah, it chose me, I think.
I love that. Well, I really love the sweetness in this book, even during like the sad moments. And I've been thinking so much about the overlapping of Queenie's and Audrey's story. But then Queenie is also like so nuanced and complicated. And there were moments, well, the one moment I struggled with her loyalty to Audrey's daughter Makiba by not intervening in a way I felt like she should have intervened. And but she was present and you know, also moving in that super familiar way that happens in black families where you defer to the mother or parent. Like whatever they decide about their kid, that's none of your business, basically. And I think, yeah, so I struggle with that, but I also feel like Queenie was kind of like a reminder about our grandmothers and these matriarchs that we look up to, about them being like complicated and human. And so, with this dynamic of Queenie, Makiba, and Audrey, what were you sitting with when you were like building these characters and their relationships to each other?
Yeah, I think for me, and you already kind of were speaking to it, Danny, I was thinking about how complicated family relationships are. And I think generationally, like everybody's having a different experience with different people. So, whereas like my nephew, for example, him and my mom are super close and just tight in this way that, you know, us as her daughters, we have a different relationship and still very close and still very loving and whatnot. But there's ways that, like, I think we get to know our grandma's personality differently than our parents even get to know, you know, our their parents' personality. So I think with writing this book, there were so many complicated nuances that I was playing with that at times, like, I mean, I was like, oh, like, why does Makiba have to be hard and weird and like homophobic like that, you know? And which sounds like I didn't write it, like Makiba. But you know, in some ways, it's kind of like, wow, these are the dimensions and dynamics of queer life, of family. You know, that I think there's people who will have, you know, a direct parent who may not be able to hold space and witness them, because I think parents have a lot of attachment to who we are and who we become sometimes. Um, Whereas our grandparents, they are in a stage maybe in their lives and just also in proximity to you as their grandchild, are able to offer certain kind of love and whatnot. And I think that's the case with families, no matter who the relative or adult is, you know, whether it's like an auntie or an uncle or a cousin, that can be a space of safety and softness and tenderness for you. And I definitely, in this book where I knew these Black queer kids would be navigating some challenges, I didn't want them to be bereft of softness and people who can hold them in ways that allows them to be limitless, even if they have to navigate some of these ugly, challenging things. And I also think that with families, sometimes queer people are born into families and they are really re-educating the entire family about sexuality, which I don't even think queerness is, sexuality to me is such a portion of queerness. Like, I think queerness is so much about kind of resisting a way of living that is oppressive and prescribed by people who want to oppress us and drain us. So I think when writing these dynamics of intergenerational stuff, I just was playing and just exploring things, and I really had fun once I realized that Queenie was a character. Because initially when I was writing, I didn't realize how big a character Queenie was going to be. I didn't know if she was just going to stay in that moment in Trinidad, but she ended up, as I was writing, Queenie kept on showing up and showing her layers and her complexity, which I think is a thing that I desired to know from my grandmother, was her, how she felt as a teenager, how she felt as a child, what were the ways that she felt like me and I felt like her, but because of the way I was introduced to her as like this 50-some-year-old woman who was the mother of my mother, I didn't understand that she too was a girl who was exploring and navigating life in heavy, especially thinking about Trinidad, where my grandmother, one side of my family's from Trinidad, the other side is from St. Croix, Virgin Islands. And my Trinidadian grandmother was so kind of humble and chill, super funny, super cool, but just a mystery in a lot of ways. And the older I got, I just was wondering, what was it like for her to be a girl? What were her dreams? Did she ever imagine Minnesota? Did she think she would die in one of the coldest places in the world? You know, this Trinidadian born woman. So I think in writing the book, I just got a lot of permission for people to be complicated, for people to be beautiful, for people to teach us things about ourselves that through just learning little snippets of their story. So, yeah.
I had a quick follow up.
Hmm.
I love that you mentioned family because I was wondering, depending on who you talk to, some people don't think it's a good thing when your life like influences your work heavily, but I love that. I don't see how your life doesn't. Um so I was wondering, were you, and I feel like you might have touched on this earlier, but do you feel like you were writing to parts of your childhood or your child self as you were writing this, or your teen self?
Entirely. Entirely. I think it was interesting because, you know, when you get older, even if you were a kid, you know, when you were a teen and you knew that you were going to plan to stay the same and stay just as cool as you were when you were young, when them bills show up, when these responsibilities come knocking at your door, you know, there's parts of yourself that like get lost in the sauce. And I really wanted the book to feel like some of the books I read as a teen that felt like, oh, they get it. They get what it feels like to be in this space in life where there's a lot of tension between this beautiful young self and the precipice of this adult self that really wants you to exchange your wonder and your magic for responsibility and like conformity. So I think for me, writing the book, I went back to my journals, I went back to notes and like old things of mine from my adolescence to get to that raw, messy, complicated self that I think is such a part of young adult literature. And I also wasn't a young person that felt comfortable being out as a queer person. And I so wish I could go back and give myself permission to be. And I also, as a young person, longed for books where I could see Black queer sexuality and how it's navigated, you know? So if, and this is a thing I even can speak to with my friends who are my age, you know, I just turned 40 this year, and they're curious about dating women, you know, other women, you know, and them being sort of stunted as sort of like, how do you navigate that? How do you navigate telling a woman you're interested in her? Because we're so indoctrinated with how heterosexuality does it, you know, how the man is supposed to approach and how the woman is supposed to respond, and all of these things that we then start to feel like we lack language for queer connection. And I think for the book, I wanted to write about sensuality and have these Black girls navigate being a Black girl, loving on another Black girl, and seeing our divinity as Black girls through that intimacy, which as a young person, there's maybe one or two books that I got, maybe one book that, two, I can think of two books, The Color Purple and Ruby by Rosa Guy, were books where I was like, oh wow, there's Black queer girls that exist in the world and in literature. So, you know, to your question, Danny, it really was a thing that I didn't think I could exist until I was way later in life. I think partly due to lack of representation. And I think in writing this book, I got so interested about how do I make it hot and sexy? Because as a teen, I was always looking for the juicy parts, looking for those parts that, you know, where I could reread and kind of touch myself, maybe even, you know, and that was a gift I wanted to give, you know, to young people, that it's not, I mean, and I may have said this, and I'm sure I've said it in other interviews, but I would literally read like Interview with a Vampire and like vampire shit to try to get some sexy stuff in my life as a young, like the access to like sensuality very much existed in white space, and it wasn't, and it often was replicating a lot of these negative and violent and rape culture-y sprinkled energies around relationships. And I wanted this book to very seamlessly speak to my sexual and pleasure politics, even though it was a young adult book. I wanted you know, when Mabel and Audrey were having their moments of actually bridging that connection, that it was sexy as hell and also had consent and also had them comfortable with communicating what they wanted. Where I think for me as a young person, whenever we talk about sexuality in any form, we don't talk. People just, or it's just kind of like, all right, you kind of rub, you kind of touch, you kind of whatever, and then it falls into that. But being able to have language around, this does not feel good, or I want that, or I'm comfortable with that, I actually do want you to do that. I think that's a thing that particularly Black women and Black queer folks, we don't have sort of opportunities to see that in the world of Black women and Black queer folks and non-binary folks being like, I want this feeling, I want this pleasure, and I'm not going to feel like I'm displacing my pleasure to center other people's pleasure or center people's ideas of what makes me pleasurable. And I think it's such a persistent, important thing to navigate, because yeah, like even in my 20s I struggled with, how do I speak to my desire, and feeling like I had to you know, frame it in ways that made me seem acceptable and comfortable to people. So in a lot of ways, even writing this book healed those things, because young people of y'all's generation and younger to me are teaching me like, yeah, girl, you can be a freak, you can be pro ho, you can twerk on someone, you can twerk your ass directly into your Instagram if that's your tea, if that's what you like to do. So yeah.
Okay, I'm just adding this one more thing, that the moment
Please.
between Neri and Audrey, I just want to say it was magical, and now I need to be on the ocean with somebody. That's all.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do. Well, that's what I'm saying. It's just like, give us sexy, beautiful, magical context to be sexy with each other at that. You know, like I'm working on my second book right now, and yeah, I mean, this next book about to be like, you know, too hot for TV. No, I'm kidding. But but I really am just going there and knowing that young people are being talked about sensuality and sexuality and pleasure all the time, but they're being taught in a white, patriarchal, heterosexual, homophobic lens still to this day. And I think that's been a thing that I want to sort of care for in my writing, is that how do I include the body and include desire within it, and know that it's not a taboo thing, that in fact young white boys are being taught to pursue their pleasure and desire all the time, you know, and we're taught to help provide it for them, actually, in a lot of ways. That's what our programming is. So a lot of it is like my work to deprogram and decolonize all of these things that really have been segregated. Like I was said this to a friend of mine, like whiteness has colonized pleasure for themselves, colonized like all of the ways of comfort and sweetness for themselves, and that we are the providers of it in any, you know, in all of these ways. So I think the younger us as Black folks can be like, oh yeah, we could lay up in the park and like make out with somebody and not feel like we lazy or we hoochie or all the things that kind of sit in our brain when we're just being still and being ourselves. So, and you definitely, Danny, I'm gonna pray for that you gonna just have somebody, you laying up in the water splashes your feet, you take a chew of a mango, you know, they hand you a cold jar of water, and it's just, we need it, we deserve it, our ancestors deserved it, and we got to do it for them, you know.
I am glad that you included these sensual scenes in your young adult, because I know like there's been discourse on Twitter lately about whether or not sex should be included in young adult because of teens, but I'm like, that is something that teenagers have to deal with. It would be better to show like, hey, these are positive examples, and then here's some negative examples. Like,
well, and thank you for letting me know about the Twitter conversation. I didn't know about that.
yeah.
So people are saying, who is saying it exactly?
I'm not sure
Well,
who said it. I know it was like a blue check mark that said it. It was like some white guy or something.
I'm sure. Well, that's why I was just curious about it, because I do think it's like there's political power in disconnecting young people from the body. You know, like there's power, because I mean, and it shapeshifts, right? So when I was coming up, it was all teen pregnancy, oh my god, like, you know, these Black girls are fast, and you know, all of this stigma around our sexuality. Like they'll stigmatize our sexuality real quick the minute we show a sprinkle of it, right? And want to act like it doesn't exist, when I think like I am raising, I have a bonus daughter, and her sort of understanding of pleasure and witnessing her like touching herself happened from a very young age. So I think like this delusion that if we act like it doesn't exist, then nobody's experiencing it, is totally just such an age old delusion. And it's so, I don't know. Yeah, it's like that's archaic. Like that's the old shit. Like people who are on that tip are going to be obsolete on their own, on their own dime and stuff like that. But I do appreciate people kind of resisting that way of thinking, because even me, when I was writing my book, I was like, can I write certain things? Can I write about teens smoking weed? Is that responsible? Is that bad or whatever? But I was like, why don't I talk about it in a context that is actually Black, feminist, magical, queer, grounded, rather than war on drugs and war on Black female sexuality and Black queer femme non-binary sexuality, all of the things, and they ain't slick. You know what I'm saying? But it is fascinating to hear that people are still trying to push that. Like, come on now.
So I wanted to go back to Queenie for a bit. So in the book, Audrey gives Mabel a dream tonic to help her with her sleep. And so Mabel starts dreaming about Audrey's grandma, Queenie, as a teen. And I feel like you had a lot going on within the realms of dreams. You were talking kind of like time traveling, experiencing someone else's life. So my question is, what do you think is possible in dreams?
Oh my gosh, I love that question. Y'all ask good questions, by the way. Not
Thank
to
you.
like, y'all ask excellent questions. I just think I don't get dreams. They're so magical. They're so vast, and they're so within us. They're so personal. Like there's people who I have recurring dreams about who I don't really talk to regularly, and I would never tell them because they'd be like, what's that about, Junauda? But, there's people like dreams are symbolic. Dreams, I think, come from previous lifetimes at times. They come from different dimensions in ourselves that are so full. And I think one thing with my grandma, my Trinidadian grandmother, she very much, and I think a lot of Black folks, and, I think like Black femmes and women, maybe even in particular, really do see dreams as conversations with spirit and the other side. And I wanted to explore that for these young girls, because I think a lot of us have remembrances of our grandmothers or elders in the family being like, "Oh, I had this dream," or this dream, I had, like my mom, she's like, "I had the weirdest dream. I was walking around barefoot and da 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 da." Like it's like sometimes those little details, like, "Oh, I was walking around barefoot," has like a huge significance. And so in this book, I wanted to play around with meaning and portaling and exploration and the ways that dreams are a daily opportunity to leave this conscious reality and go into like a totally experimental symbolic journey for those of us who remember our dreams, or are interested in delving into that. And so for me, and playing around with, and I don't even know how I came up with it, honestly. Some of this stuff is like, I'm like, how did, like, even in retrospect, I'm like, I don't quite remember when that idea came, but I do remember that I was like, what if like these girls just explored their and like encouraged, I was like, yeah, Dreamo, this Dreamo experiment. Yeah, it just kind of came about organically. But the more I started writing it, then when these moments of, because like Queenie would come up in these random spaces and like these other things would come up, and I was like, oh, I didn't know where they were coming from in my brain. I was like, why am I thinking about Queenie when this is about Mabel and Audrey? And I was like, is this my slick way of procrastinating writing my book by writing about the grandma character? You know how you got to check yourself, like, what you trying to do, sis? I'm seeing you. So I was like, but then I shared it with my editor and he loved it. Even that chapter, the chapter where Queenie is like gets into a fight, I was like, I don't know why I'm writing this, but this is just came to me. Queenie's whooping someone's ass in Trinidad. But part of it was inspired by my own grandmother when I went to Trinidad and I was hanging out with her sister, who was telling me, he's like, yeah, your grandma used to fight, and then she started telling me all these stories. And here's my grandma right here. I'm actually looking at her while I'm talking to y'all. But this is my Trinidadian grandmother. in Jamaica, actually, on a vacation. So this is like in the 90s, even though this looks like it was probably, you know, in the 40s or something, but except she got a fanny pack, which is very 90s. But yeah, like she she was like telling me all these stories of my grandma in like the hood in Trinidad and Port of Spain, Laventil, just fighting. And I just like could you imagine your grandmother's whoop? Maybe y'all can. I don't know what y'all grandmothers are like, or you know, some people are like, yes, I very much can imagine my grandma whooping ass. Actually, she did so this week, you know, but and in my grandma exactly. And I think like I could see my grandma
definitely
whooping
could.
like children, but like actually fighting and like throwing bows. But how about you, Leah? What were you gonna say?
I was going to say I couldn't. She does not seem like the kind of person that fights.
Right. But I feel like there's a legacy of Black girls whooping ass that like because I used to get in like my little soft hippie nerd ass would get in fights with kids because they thought I would be an easy pick. You know, they'd be like, oh, she's soft immigrant weird kid, you know. And then I was like, y'all have no idea the things churning in my spirit. Like I will gladly fight all y'all little hood asses. Like my little hood school, we was fighting, like constantly fighting, you know, which anyway, so like kind of playing with that remembrance in me of being a kid that because I was so picked on, I would fight, you know, and then going and learning about my grandma being a fighter, which to me was so like, what? Like, and how did I not think I might have gotten it from her? Like, what about my imagination cut me and her off from having those things and aspects of us in common? Like, I see her power, but I also think like my grandma, like I think a lot of our grandmas, and now we would call it depression or anxiety, you know, but like I just saw my grandma have to navigate raising all of, you know, her children, you know, after my grandfather died before I was born. My grandmother moved to this country with my grandfather and he died like a year and a half later and she had like 7 kids and was in this new country. You know, my mother was the oldest and she was 19 and the youngest was 3. So I never, you know, the grandma I met was a woman who'd had that experience, you know, who'd, you know, was widowed even before I was born and had to navigate things in that way. So I didn't get to see her spark. I just saw the fear and anxiety and depression that like now I would name some of those as, and also her juicy, abundantly giving. And she was so funny. My grandma was so funny. You know how old women got such fucking lip? They so funny. And my grandma was one of those people who would just say a slick thing on the side and you just be like, what? So I feel like me, so much of Queenie in a lot of ways I think was, now I'm realizing homage to my own grandmother and the ways that Black women have to sort of become these monoliths of matriarchal support and we don't get to see, you know, ooh, who are their lovers, you know, who are the crushes of our grandmothers, who were the people that they were like would fight for, you know, as teens. So yeah, I think that like the Dreamo was just my way to like explore and find these forgotten stories and experiences that I think so for me, like, you know, for me, so was so central to my existence, you know? So yeah.
Hearing you say that, it reminded me of like my grandma. So most of my life she's been single, and I remember one time we were like going through pictures and there was this picture of her with this strange man who was not my grandfather or her second husband.
Strange man.
Yeah, strange man. It wasn't my grandfather.
Sorry to this man.
It wasn't her second husband. And so I was like, who is this man? And my mom was like, that's your grandma's ex-boyfriend. Like, Granny had a boyfriend. But yeah, like we don't realize, like, you know, our parents, our grandparents are people too, and with needs as well.
You said grandma had needs. Oh, I love that. You were like this strange man. Just the way you said strange man. You're like, get off my grandma. Even in the picture, like you want him to get off. Oh, I love it.
I was thinking about too with my grandma. So my grandma and her one of her older sisters who just recently passed, like one of my favorite aunties, they never married, which was, to me it seemed just based on the generation they come from, it seemed like scandalous that they never married, and they both seem kind of like free in certain ways, especially my grandma's older sister. So she's like in her 80s, but she was just always so independent. She always had like they have like those men friends. I have another my paternal grandmother too. She had this man that used to come around and help her all the time. And then I found out from my cousins that was like, oh yeah, they used to go together, but he still be coming around. And I just, like, but I feel like all of the matriarchs in my family were just, with all the faults and stuff they went through, they still were free in ways that I think was like, radical for coming from Mississippi and that kind of thing. Like they did what they want to do and they didn't back down from anybody. So I love that. That's what I was thinking about.
Oh my gosh. I'm so glad we all brought our grandmas in this space and their little side boos and things like that. Cause I do think there's this way that when we think of Black elder women, we desexualize, we just desexualize all older women, but Black women in particular. And also sort of, I love the way that we just speak to that casual desire and pleasure of like, yeah, like this person brings me pleasure and he fixes stuff and what have you, that is a very, and also very revolutionary and radical compared to how a lot of us are, or our society looks at how women should treat the men in their lives. They should want to marry. They should want to have this certain kind of commitment or what have you. And I do think I similarly can relate to having women in my family who didn't marry, didn't want to be married, was married, stopped being married, never took a name, all of that stuff. And these were the tropes that whiteness wanted to make us feel was the sort of summit of what relationships are and what womanhood and all of these things are, and how Black women consistently was like, yeah, that's y'all bag. Like, we gonna do us. We gonna decide what makes sense to us, of even the things that are offered in that context of relationships. Like I love, I mean, my mom too, she's super cute, Trinidadian woman of a certain age. And, she's constantly just knows what she won't deal with. Like, she's not going to do it. So we are so lucky to be, raised by these people.
So I cried like a baby at the end of this. Like I literally had to just pause and it just hit me. But it wasn't even, it was hard. It's hard to articulate it because it wasn't even sadness. It was just the love, like just to the very end. I love love, which is, I don't know, it's something about it. I just love it. Even even if it's not in my life. And so everything that occurred just seemed like divinely orchestrated. And to me, this book says so much about like the limitlessness of love and pleasure and the sweetness it brings into our lives. And it reminds me that like, I don't know, like you never know how long you have to live and that we should be prioritizing sweetness, which is why this is relevant. Cause I've been thinking about it. I'm like, I feel like, I don't know, maybe it was an ancestor whispering in my ear, but it's like, you don't got enough sweetness in your life and you just sitting around here bitter. So,
wow.
And I know you call
that sound like something an ancestor would say. An ancestor would straight up say that to your face.
Yes. Listen, because it came to me and I was like, ouch, but also it's true. So I was going to ask you something that you actually kind of answered. So I actually just want you to talk about what does it mean to be a pleasure activist? And like, especially because I feel like that term, I've never heard anyone use that, but it makes sense for this. Like, it makes sense that the author of this book is a pleasure activist because it was so pleasurable. Like, it was pleasure was at the center of everything. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, it's interesting because I'm in my friend Adrienne Marie Brown's book, Pleasure Activism, which that was the first I'd ever heard of that term. And it's been great to have like a framework to think about pleasure as active commitment, because that's what activism is to me. You know, it's a thing that I'm saying I'm committing to shifting in a way in my life and in my time. Being in that book actually really sort of forced me to confront that sort of stream, or, you know, through line in my work, is like, and also a desire to go into the depth of the Black experience, which I think is so often translated in traumatic ways, you know, in these very sort of re-traumatizing ways. And I think I am, and maybe it's the youth worker in me, because I spent so much of my life as a youth worker. Like, even as we're teaching people things, like, what is the sort of pedagogy of support? And sweetness is like the best pedagogy. Like, you know, when you, and maybe this is something I learned in second grade when we used to have to do the multiplication sheets, and then we'd get 2 Oreos if you got all of them hoes right, you know, and them Oreos tasted so good. And the stress of the multiplication, 3 times 6, oh, boom, boom, you got to get it, bow, bow, bow. You have like, I forgot how much time we had. And man, and that must have been hard for them kids, because I was good at math. Anyways, now I'm thinking about some other ableism shit that I thought about. That just really took me someplace, but let me stay on topic. But for me, I just know learning and growing deserves sweetness, because it's hard. And not saying that hard things sometimes just can't be just hard. And I think that exists in my book too, and in my art. And I also want to give people so much love. And that's how it is in my life. Like, if you, one of my peoples, like, I'm just crazy with the sweetness, you know, like, it's just my thing. And I just feel like, you know, what you were saying, like your ancestors were telling you, Danny, like, yeah, man, you being stingy with your sweetness to yourself. You know, that's the thing I totally have been learning, because I will give and love on everybody, but it's a thing that I really had to learn to give myself. So anyways, like, I've been playing with this term because I see myself as a priestess, you know, as like, but like I've been called to priestesshood for a long time. And when I think of the kind of priestesshood I'm pulled to, it's pleasure priestesshood, pleasure priestess. So I have been playing with, like, I'm a pleasure priestess, you know, and that exists in my writing, that exists in how I love on people and how I do my rituals for my ancestors. Like, I guess like sometimes I'll be like in my room and like I'll be in front of my altar and I'm dancing and I'm like, you know what, ancestors, no, this is for you. Like, I'm going to do this for us, you know, like, or when I'm singing, like, I'll just sing to my ancestors. And, you know, I used to think that being in ritual had to be so, you know, kind of upright, and you need to get it perfect. You don't want to make a mistake, and you don't want to do something nasty, and you want to really sort of like compartmentalize your sensual and sexual and pleasure self from your spiritual and soulful and, you know, religious or what have you self. And I realized, like, oh, that's white supremacy. You know, that's sort of the co-option of Christianity that has been such a aspect of existence, you know, not the actual Jesus Christianity, because they was probably some hoes, some hoochies accepting everybody, you know what I'm saying? But like the kind that white folks was like, let's doctor this shit up and colonize the world with it. You know, let's disconnect the sensuality and the sexuality and the nature, put them in like cement spaces and make them I dare them to try to find God in there. I dare them to try to find divinity. No, instead, they'll find shame, they'll find self-judgment, and they'll be perfect for molding, you know? And that's what I was playing with the church and the book, Come Here, You Rebel, Come Here, with, you know, Audrey and Neri, you know, where they would be in church all day and they'd love the music and all of the vibes. And of course, church has spirit and divinity and sweetness. Like, that's going to be there too. And then they took it and then they reimagined it for themselves in this way of being like, oh, hey, we're just going to swim in the ocean and, you know, eat mangoes and, you know, make out. And that's church, you know? And for me, like, pleasure is a thing that I am, you know, to answer your question around pleasure activism, it's a thing I'm constantly centering and being like, yeah, pleasure belongs here too. You know, pleasure belongs here too. You know, this thing, and it's a thing that lives in my marriage with my wife, you know, because it's so easy to just be so responsible together as a domestic partnership. But I'm like, nah, pleasure, I deserve to have pleasure, even if my house is messy, even if the dishes aren't clean, which I know being raised, it was like, you ain't doing nothing till this whole house clean. Nothing can happen until everything is perfect by these standards that actually were instilled in us, because that's what the white man expected of their lives that we needed to build for them. You know, you need to keep all of this clean so we could have pleasure, you know? And it's like these things that we've internalized, that all of these responsible and good things need to happen, productive things rather need to happen in order for us to experience pleasure. And that's the thing that I have to actively disrupt within myself, you know, and feel like, yeah, like I could be on a podcast and smoke my little J and have my little Mexi closet. And I could feel like okay with myself. There's nothing I should feel ashamed of with myself. And so that to me is like pleasure activism is like a radical sort of, because actually last year, because, you know, I'm based in Minneapolis, y'all may know. So literally last year, like our whole city just was like a phoenix, like blew up and was like these things rising. And one of the things that rose up in me is like, if I'm going to be a leader in abolition on whatever level in this lifetime, not even a leader, a participant in abolition, because all that leader bullshit is bullshit. So that was a slip of the Freudian tongue. But like, to be a facilitator and an engager and a magnifier of abolition, I actually need to go up and abolitionize some shit up in my damn self, you know? And that's like, I've been writing, and I'm going to share more this idea of the erotics of abolition, you know? Like, how am I living in the ways that I police my pleasure, I police my visions for myself, I police my dreaming, you know? And I need to actually focus on healing that work of like letting my pleasure go wild, my erotic and sort of multi-dimensional selves be free and healed, as an aspect of abolition work, as an aspect of activism and resistance. You know, I can't say, hey, I'm going to be leading people, but meanwhile, I got hang-ups around my sexuality and my body, which I can, you know, you can do anything, but I also wanted to include that as a part of my way of being, is dealing with my own internalized self. Because last year when all the shit hit the fan locally, all of these leaders locally, all of us were projecting our trauma onto each other, and we're triggered by our trauma, but then all of a sudden we're like, oh, we're having to stand up and lead, and we're doing these things. And it was a hot mess, y'all. It was a hot mess, and it's a hot mess anyway. I want to have y'all, you know, call and response. You know, that's our tradition. So I don't know what y'all are thinking about. Or
I actually love, you know, man, I want everybody's story up in here. Like I left it, man,
mm,
like I want to know more about Afua. I want to know more
mm,
about Queenie and Makiba, because
mm,
and I also like the undertones of like, so I'm probably not gonna describe this term right, but in Hari's Zaid's book,
mm,
Black Boy Out of Time, they talk a lot about like carceral dissonance and like the
mm,
ways our society, the structure of like this very kind of like prison industrial complex, we like internalize it. We're constantly
mm,
policing ourselves, we're constantly policed, especially as children.
mm,
And just kind of to have that undertone of like the kind of violence of incarceration, like the idea that someone hasn't seen the stars in years, like has
mm,
not experienced that. um I don't know, I feel like a lot of queer folks specifically, and even myself, like thinking about abolition not just in like the what you think about, which is getting rid of prisons, but like abolition as in like getting rid of like the prisons that we have internalized, if that makes sense.
yes.
um yeah, it's hard for me to explain this because I'm one of those people where I'm like in the background of the abolition discussions because I'm like, I don't want to say the wrong thing, but also I'm still trying to understand because it's so
Mm-hmm.
hard to think of like restorative justice. Like it's so hard to think about what does justice look like. And I've come to, this is a tangent, but I think
Oh,
something that
please.
has helped me a lot is I think that justice is just, it like transcends anything that we could imagine in like the earthly realm. And that's really what's helping me to like understand the work that abolitionists are doing. And that it's possible. Like what seems impossible is possible. And so I love that it's coming up in places that you wouldn't expect it.
Yeah, it's I think it's a thing. I mean, you spoke it so beautifully, around the ways that just sort of figuring ourselves out. And um yeah. Yeah, and I think the thing with abolition is that we get to go deep with this journey. I think abolition has been a thing that has been going to work since the United States forced its enslavement onto this sacred land. People have been working on abolition, and I think there's ways that um yeah, just giving ourselves permission to be free, giving ourselves permission to see how acceptable it has been to police and incarcerate Black people, and in so many ways, and how, oh, actually, what you were saying that made me think of something around Lil Nas X, because I've been listening to Montero like I'm a little 15 queer. I was like, hopefully people don't think like, Junauda, why are you out here? But I love that little boy, okay? And actually he's right here too, Lil Nas X.
Oh,
I love him too.
same.
I know. And I just think it's sort of, how his being himself is literally triggering all of these other um, Black heterosexual men around their sexuality. And around feeling as though, either, people like Kid Cudi, who you could see Kid Cudi's like, oh my gosh, like, here's somebody who's articulating some things I've been trying to articulate and whatnot. And then people like Boozy Badass, who, is so triggered, like by free Black sexuality in a masculine form. And I think it's a thing that part of this abolition, what would it be like if part of abolition, yes, prisons, yes, the, police state and all this stuff. But if Black men could move around in this society and not feel like they had to police their own sexuality and other sexuality, they could suck a little dick here and there and they could talk about it. You know what I mean? And it's like, oh yeah, man, yeah, it's a thing I like to do sometimes, or whatever. Because there's ways that they're very comfortable in speaking about sexuality when it comes to women or this what have you, but there's just so much shame, and I think it comes from a lot of reasons. Maybe their own sexual desire for other men, as well as their own sexual trauma, which I think a lot of men don't know how to talk about. Like, I was reading this incredible book recently, Saga Boy, written by Antonio Michael Downing, and Trinidadian writer. And he talks about, because Saga Boy is like another word for like a playboy or fuck boy in like Trinidadian context. And, he talked about being that kind of man and like, having this facade, and kind of this need. Now he's like a very free spirited, brother and stuff like that with his gender and expression and stuff. But as a young child, experienced sexual violence, and rape by another man, and I think like I don't know, and maybe I'm going too deep and I don't want to like psychoanalyze our people and our homophobia because that's like, there's so many reasons as to why we feel homophobic and internalized homophobia. But I do think like this idea of abolition is like, what are all of these things that we react really strongly to, or the ways that, we default to trusting white folks and mistrusting and not trusting Black people on site. Like, I think that was the thing I noticed last year, was that a lot of us as Black activists did not trust each other. We didn't trust each other. And there's reasons why, and there's reasons why based off of things other people have done. And there's reasons why people just don't trust no other Black person, even if they say they're pro-Black, so anyhow, it's a doozy, girl.
So this is the last question that we have. This has been a great
Aw, that
conversation
was
so
so
far. I
fun.
know. Thank you. Thank you for talking with us. So it's a fun question. So in the book, Mabel adores Whitney Houston. And much of this book feels kind of like a love letter to Whitney and who she could have been as a queer Black woman. So, a question for all of us is, what has Whitney Houston meant for your life? I can go first. So,
Please.
okay, so I remember when I was younger, so I am in a family of like 6 people. I've always had to share a room with someone, but I would like sneak out to the car and I don't know whose cassette tape it was, but there was a cassette tape, and on one side it was like All the Man That I Need, I think, and the other side was like Greatest Love of All. It was something like that. But I would like put in the cassette tape and I would just sing along with Whitney Houston, and it was like this big cathartic feeling because she had
Mm,
this huge voice and I felt powerful
mm,
and beautiful and all of these things. And I remember when she died, there was such a lack of care
mm,
around her death. And it, I was still kind of young. I was still a teenager when it happened. Um, but it's only until recently, until like I'm seeing more of her in interviews and more of like what she did. Like she was executive producer of The Princess Diaries, and she also kind of took Destiny Child under her wing, and she did that with like a lot of young Black female
oh, I didn't know
artists.
that. I
Yeah,
did
she
not
did.
know that.
Kelly Rowland was talking about how Whitney Houston told them to call her Aunt Whitney. Anything she wants, let them know she's gonna give it to them. And
Wow.
this was when they were like 15, 16. They were really young. Um, so yeah, like as I'm getting older and I'm learning more about like the kind of person she is, I'm knowing now kind of what a loss it was to lose her,
Mm.
and just how much of herself she gave to us, and it wasn't appreciated.
Listen, listen, I know.
Yeah.
Ugh, no, it's like, I don't know how you look like as a kid, but I'm imagining you with that same hairdo, but smaller, like in the car
I
singing.
have little afro puffs when I was
Yeah, yeah. I can see that. I can see that. Oh my God. The gospel, like, the cathedral of her voice, really, like, listening to her voice is walking into a cathedral of sound.
Mm.
Mm. What's your story, Danny?
It's funny because I feel like I've been mentioning this all season about like inner child work and how I'm doing inner child work, which means it's so much stuff that I've forgotten about that now has been coming up. So as a kid, I was like super lonely for a period of my life. I'm the oldest. I have two other siblings, but there are periods of time we lived apart from each other. But my grandma had lots of cassette tapes, and she had Whitney Houston, Smokey Robinson, so many people. There's this guy who I think he was very similar to Luther Vandross in his voice. I forget his name, but I loved him. Um, anyway, with Whitney Houston, she had a couple of her tapes, and I used to listen to them all the time. Like for some reason, Saving All My Love for You was like that one, and You Give Good Love. I loved those, and I loved when Whitney would do those high notes, and so I used to just listen to it over and over again.
Mm.
And I think like you, Leah, she just made me feel beautiful. She made made me feel warm inside. She made my chest flutter when she would
Mm.
sing those high notes. Um, I love the Waiting to Exhale soundtrack still to this day. Um, but knowing that Whitney, there were these rumors around her queerness, and then Robin comes out and tells her story, which a lot of people had whatever feelings they had about it. I don't believe in coincidences most of the time. Like, I don't know. She did something for me as a kid, and like knowing that about her, it makes me sad, but I'm also, yeah, I don't even know how to describe it, but I think that Whitney just made me feel good. She made me feel good in my body. Like I could still listen to her song And that was something that people like her and their music did for me. They gave my body a feeling that was unfamiliar, which was a good feeling. So yeah, I hope that makes sense. I'm rambling, but pleasure. Pleasure is what she did for me. So
Yeah, no, Whitney. Yeah, I think like I didn't realize how much she was there for my young black queer girl self until I think you're naming, like, really since she died, because I think that was a thing that I had known about. Actually, I'd learned about it when she was still alive, like around '06. I'd moved to New York and I was kicking it with this sister who's, was a dancer and performer in New York. And she was like talking about Whitney. She's like, oh, yeah, Whitney's bisexual, And she's like, yeah, everybody knows that. And I was like, everybody knows that? I didn't know that. Because I'm younger. Like, she was like Whitney's age. And, I don't know, 20 years younger than Whitney or something like that. And she's like, oh, yeah, her and her best friend Robin, it's like Whitney's crazy. But Robin was the, like, would be her little grounding force. And here go Whitney, show and tell, you know, um, this magazine I found randomly with her beautiful face painted. Um, but yeah, so I remember that was the first time of me conceiving of her queer, was like, what? This was like when her and Bobby had that television reality show. So I think for me, like, getting to sort of kind of go back and remember her in the context of um, this book, of like reimagining and laying on the layer of queerness into my memories of her, because as a young person she was just sort of asexual, which I think many pop artists were at that time, even if they had love interest or romance in their songs, except for somebody like Prince, who was like, listen, you don't see my sexuality, but like most, or Madonna, like those were sort of the like sex forward, kind of among the sex forward artists, because of course there were tons, but Whitney certainly was supposed to be asexual, just like be a voice, be a cathedral, and so for me, like, being in the process of writing this book, I mean, I was just writing the story initially, and Whitney kept showing up. This was, I started writing the book, I guess, about 6 years after she had passed, 5 or 6 years, and she just kept on showing up, like at a coffee table book, of Whitney's pictures, and being like, oh, Whitney, Whitney Houston just evokes so much love in people, and she's a Leo, so she just has so much love to give. Um, so yeah, so like, that for me has been my sort of love, is just getting to experience Whitney all these years and just seeing how she um yeah, like as an ancestor, really, she gets to blossom in ways that sadly her earthly life was just tethered to a lot of oppression and, bullshit. But she's given us so much, but yeah. Thank y'all so much for this interview and inviting me to be here with y'all. This has been amazing. Y'all are the bomb.
Yay, thank you.
thank you. So Leah, what are you holding on to from this interview?
Um, Actually, so much. Like you said earlier, this was such a fun interview, and Junauda talks about so many different things. But I really loved how she talked about how whiteness colonized pleasure for itself, and how many times when we deny ourselves pleasures due to white supremacy. And it reminds me again of something my professor said, that was like, most Black issues are due to white supremacy. But yeah, it was a necessary reminder for me to not feel so guilty when my house isn't clean, cuz like her, I was also taught, like, you can't do anything until your room is clean, you can't do anything until your house is clean. So for me, I'll be like, I don't deserve to have pleasure cuz my house ain't clean. And so I really appreciate her calling that out and being like, no, you do deserve to have pleasure even when your house ain't clean. So I'm like, thank you for that. I also loved when she talked about her grandma's life as a child. And before I re listened to this podcast, I was writing about this picture I saw of my grandma in her 20s, and I was speculating like what her life might have been like. And I thought I was doing something. And then I re-listened to this and it was like, no, Junauda had already talked about this before. And I was like, oh, that may be where I got the idea from in the back of my head. But yeah, I really love how like we think that these things about us make us special and unique. And a lot of times they're inherited. They are things that have been passed down to us. Um, and something else that stuck out to me was her observation on doing abolition work and how that starts with us. And I know we said many times on the podcast, and we'll probably keep saying that it's so important for us to do our own internal work. It's so important to unlearn these violent systems that have indoctrinated us. And for me, she reminded me about my own internalized restrictions on pleasure, how I think pleasure is something that needs to be earned, but not something that I deserve for just existing, and that we deserve pleasure without work. So, just a little reminder. So, we're heading to a Venus retrograde in December, and Venus rules over love, money, and beauty. And some advice that have been shared with me on how to navigate this is to indulge in yourself, to love on yourself, and to embrace everyday pleasures. So, yeah. What about you? What are you still holding on to?
I love that. And I needed that message. Well, there's definitely some overlap, but I'll start with that. I really loved what she said about queerness being a resistance to a way of living that is oppressive. I think that understanding of queerness makes so much sense given these characters. Outside of the two main characters, I think all the women, specifically with the exception of Audrey's mother, of course, were like queer in how they approached life, how they looked at the world, even in terms of like their spiritual practices. And then I also love the conversation that we talked about with giving young people access to examples of sexuality and sexual experiences that are healthy and consensual and that fall outside of white patriarchal homophobic lens. When I think about all the inaccurate information that was floating around when we were teenagers, especially among the girls, it was horrible, and it was always information that decentered our autonomy and pleasure. Um, so I definitely needed access to that because, like Junata, I was always looking for the juiciness of stories. Um, I remember how I felt when I first came across that scene in The Color Purple between Celie and Suge, and I think that was the first time read in a book this sort of sensuality and learning your body through between black women, between yeah.
So my grandma had like this bookshelf of like erotic books, and I was in like ninth grade when I started reading them. And I remember one time I was reading it at school, and this coach was like, "You shouldn't be reading that," and I'm like, "Why not?" But yeah, he was the health coach too. So
Child, listen, I mean, we also had access. I don't know how we used to get access to those books, but Zane and other like erotic stuff I used to borrow from friends. But even that was so male centered to me. Like it was
it was.
always like your pleasure is dependent on men, and I don't know. It was enough juiciness for me and being a teenager and puberty and all that stuff, but there was still always something missing for me. Um, and then to kind of overlap with what you said about whiteness colonizing pleasure and sweetness, especially for us, is that I was really, during that conversation, I was really thinking about how we have internalized those behaviors and attitudes that restrict us from accessing pleasure. And I don't know if this is 100% the same, but I feel like it's in conversation with the conversation that was happening on Twitter. I don't know if you saw the black mother who people were upset with because she had a postpartum doula, this black mother. She made this really cute TikTok of how her night goes when the doula comes. Basically, it was like she comes, I get everything for the baby ready, similar to when I was babysitting, what the mother did. Like she got everything prepped for me, and then she went on and did whatever she needed to do. And she was like, yeah, I go take me a nice bath and relax, and then I sleep, get up at 6 a.m. and relieve the doula. And people were so upset. And there were even women in the comments talking about, I was living in a different place and I didn't have any help. I didn't have my family there and I went through hell, but still I did it because that's your job. And it was just so much hostility and projection. And she revealed later in the comments that her doula maybe comes 2 to 3 times a week. It's not even every day. And then she also followed it up with a message that motherhood does not have to be rooted in struggle and it's okay to ask for help. And to me, that's connected to like restricting ourselves from pleasure and sweetness. Like you think a new mother has to go through hell because you did. Like she doesn't deserve access to like sweetness. She doesn't deserve moments of like, yes, I'm a mother, but I really need a break because this is still so new for me, or this is so overwhelming, and my body is still going through so much after literally pushing a human being through my body. Whether you did it naturally or through a C-section, you still carried this thing and it did all this stuff to your body. And so yeah, it's like so strange. It kind of goes back to what you said when you were like, just because my house is clean doesn't mean I don't deserve nice things or I don't deserve pleasure or I don't deserve this. Like, it's the same thing. People think that luxury, pleasure is a luxury and is only afforded to certain people or if you're in a certain position. Like, poor people don't deserve pleasurable things. New mothers don't deserve pleasurable things because you're a mother now and it's not about you anymore. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think people realize the way they have just internalized just really, yeah, a colonized form of like who deserves pleasure and who doesn't and that kind of thing. So I hope that wasn't a reach, but it
No, I
immediately
don't think so.
immediately reminded me of that because I was shocked. And I love that she also tweeted later, like, woo, thank God I didn't share the fact that I have someone that comes and cleans twice a week and my hairstylist comes to my house. Love to see it. Okay. Y'all gonna have to get off of it. Like, if somebody has the resources to do that, fine. That doesn't take away anything from you. And I'm so sorry that you had to go through that. Like, I'm so glad that doulas are becoming more visible because now I can't imagine not having one if I ever have
Mm-hmm.
children. Now that is something that is like it's it's not it seems like it's not even negotiable that I wouldn't have one at this point, knowing what they offer and how they lessen the burden of like being a new parent. So anyway, I'm gonna get off that tangent.
No, no, I like that you brought this up. I have not heard of this, but I found out postpartum doulas existed like a few months ago, and now I'm like, I want one. If I ever have a child, I want one. Because I cannot imagine me being home alone raising a child by myself. I'm like, I need a family member here. I need some help. Like I cannot do that by myself. Um and I do understand like a lot of people have internalized that message that, you're supposed to struggle. And I don't think that's true. I wish I could afford to get a housekeeper. And when I worked, I used to pay to get someone to cut the grass because both of us hate cutting the grass. And we used to live in a place that had an HOA and we kept getting like threatened to get fined because we never cut the grass. So we hired someone to do it and it was such a relief. Like I wish I could pay people more to do the things that I don't want to do because like we deserve to have that little bit of ease, especially if you can find some money in your budget for it.
Listen, I'm a little particular about the whole somebody coming into my house cleaning. Um but maybe I would change my mind, but I definitely am like, yes, I want a doula. Yes, I want somebody. If If a hairstylist could come to my house, thank you.
Yes.
I would pay for gas. But yeah, I don't even think people realize, even when you said during our discussion about people saying sex doesn't need to be in young adult books, I don't know what y'all think is going on with teenagers, but it's not what you think. And it doesn't matter what y'all do. The fact that that thing about Mormons, did you see that weird thing where they were talking about dipping, or what was it? Soaking,
Oh yeah, yes.
and
I've seen
coming up
that.
with all kind of excuses to engage in sex by calling it by another name, like religion, you're strict and overbearing parenting, restricting things that they have access to is not going to suddenly make all teenagers asexual or not interested in sex. Like, unless that is just naturally how they are, why not give them access to like positive examples instead of girls thinking that like they sex is just not enjoyable and it's only for men and their pleasure. Because
Mhm.
I know that when girls were talking about sex when I was a teenager, I am pretty positive most of them were lying about it being a good experience, because even the way they described it, when I think back on it, nobody was having good or healthy sex at that age, because we weren't taught anything about consent, about communicating what we like, even about like sensuality, making it into an experience that is like a full body pleasurable experience. It wasn't about that. It was just about the basics. And a lot of girls aren't taught anything, or a lot of people with vaginas are taught nothing about their bodies. So it's just, yeah, I think that this is such important work, and I'm glad that she had those moments. And it wasn't even raunchy or anything, it was so beautiful. Like, imagine being a teenager and being like, wow, it could be like this, and
Yeah.
somebody could talk, ask me this, and we could communicate. Like, yeah, I'm super thankful for that. And I think, yeah, that goes, it's all in conversation with each other. So,
So yeah, if you haven't, please, please, please read The Stars and the Blackness Between Them. Definitely one of my favorite books I've read this year. So if you like this episode, you can like, rate, and review Hoodoo Plant Mamas on Apple Podcasts. If anything from the show resonate with you, make sure to share it with us on social media. You can find us on Twitter at Hoodoo Plants and Instagram at Hoodoo Plant Mamas. Thank y'all for another season.
thank y'all so much. This was fun.
Yes.
We will see you next time.
Yeah. Bye, y'all.
Bye.